Hello and welcome to our podcast where we ask the question, how did you get that? A podcast all about media literacy and pop culture. My name is Andrew Sutherland and I'm currently a grad student. And my study of focus is on media literacy. And my co-host here today with me is Alexandra Phil.
Hey, how's it going, Andrew?
It's going well. It's going well. So we just finished our first two episodes. How are you feeling about that?
I think we recorded two episodes and we tried.
Yes. Yes. Oh boy. I definitely think we tried. I definitely think we tried. Before we move on, do you know what the rule of three is when it comes to media?
I do not know what the rule of three is. Is
So
it
I
like
think
was it 43? Is that
no,
what we're
three.
talking
No,
about?
absolutely not. Not rule 43.
Okay. Okay, so the rule of 43. Yes, I'm
No,
familiar with this.
no,
Okay. Explain it to me.
the rule of three.
Mhm.
I know I always get told this when it comes to any type of media, whether it's anime or like some sort of TV show, is you need to watch at least three episodes before you get like fully decide if you want to continue watching or continue listening to it. And we are in our third episode.
So this is kind of like make it or break it. If people don't like us here, they're just not going to like us at all.
Yeah, yeah. And I'm hoping they do like us because I think that we put this one episode together, and I think we're really going to be diving into something that I think can be very valuable and important. And so we chose for this episode, the movie or the musical Wicked, where we're going to be
Yes.
talking about specifically Wicked and how it can teach us more about like identifying propaganda.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm really excited to dive into this. So I have read as much of Gregory Maguire's book as possible. Um, it was not what I was expecting, but I'm glad to have read it. And I'm really interested to hear about the use of propaganda in the musical Wicked and where I think that originated in Maguire's book.
Yeah, yeah. But before we get in, let's do some little bit of
Mhm.
like life stuff. What you watching?
Andrew, I'm so freaking glad you asked. Oh my gosh. Recently, I introduced one of my friends to the Terminator franchise. Um, so for those of you who aren't aware, if you need a movie for a romantic date night, the movie I will always recommend every single time is the original 1984 movie Terminator. It
Why?
is one of the most romantic movies of all time.
I need you to explain to me how.
Are you kidding me? Oh my goodness. You've seen Terminator, yes?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, here's the thing. People get distracted by Arnold's big muscles and his handsome face and the fact that he's trying to kill Linda Hamilton. But what they miss out on is the beautiful love story between Kyle Reese, the soldier from the future who traveled through time to save Sarah Connor. Kyle Reese is, for those of you who don't know, he's John Connor's father. He falls in love with Sarah Connor and creates the sequence of events that allows the Terminator franchise to move forward. It is so romantic, and I feel like I am screaming this from the highest mountain, and yet people are holding their hands over their ears and saying, nah, 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 not interested. If you want, a follow-up to this romance to prove that it was a real love story between Kyle Reese and Sarah Connor. Watch the deleted scene from Terminator 2 where Kyle Reese visits sorry, I keep calling her Linda Hamilton, visits Sarah Connor in the mental hospital. It's beautiful. I cry every time I watch it.
I have now a complete new perspective on how to look at the Terminator series.
I mean, watch it with your fiance as soon as possible.
Oh, I think
Okay.
we will. I think we will. On my end, I'm currently watching a TV series that I absolutely just fell in love with. Annalisa,
Ooh.
my fiance, she got like these clips on social media of the show called uh, Dirk Gently Holistic Detective. And
Okay.
it gives off the vibe of Doctor Who in a lot of ways. The
Hmm.
whole premise is everything is connected, and the main star is Elijah Wood. Yes.
Interesting projects. Okay, I'm intrigued.
And so generally Elijah Wood plays like this downtrodden guy down on his luck. And then all things change when he's introduced to this like guy, Dirk Gently, who is a holistic detective, and all this chaos ensues. And it's their job to solve the mystery of why this chaos ensues. And it gives off both like the combination of like Doctor Who and like Sherlock Holmes.
Okay.
But
Oh, here's my confession. I don't like Doctor Who.
that's fine.
Um,
We all make mistakes.
I I know, I know. Listeners who hate me right now, in my defense, I knew people who really liked Doctor Who, and they were very annoying. So, unfortunately, I just had a hard time getting into it. But now I like to listen to people talk about it secondhand.
Okay, that's all good. Um, yeah, no, I would highly recommend this show. We just finished the second season. It's all like it's not episodic, it's all story narrative driven, and you're just trying to figure out where is this going.
Okay,
Yes.
intrigued. This it's really cool. I'll give it a shot.
Yeah, and speaking of where this is going, I think we should dive into talking about Wicked and propaganda.
Yes, I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. But before we actually do this, I think we need to give a little bit of background about Wicked and how it got inspired. And specifically, we need to talk about the early 1900s book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, written by L. Frank Baum. It follows a Kansas farm girl named Dorothy ending up in the magical land of Oz after she and her pet dog Toto are swept away from their home by a cyclone. Upon arrival in this magical world of Oz, she learns she cannot return home until she destroys the Wicked Witch of the West. During Dorothy's journey, she meets a scarecrow who wants a brain, a tin man who wants a heart, and a cowardly lion who only wishes to have the nerve. When it comes to this book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, you ultimately probably engage with it with its inspirational movie that ultimately introduced like the first real movie that introduced color. The book and movie gained popularity over the century and eventually led to other works of inspiration. Specifically, for this purpose of the episode, we'll be covering the revisionist prequel that imagines a more complicated landscape than we see in other films and books of The Wizard of Oz, specifically Wicked.
Uh, though before we go into Wicked, Andrew, I did want to ask you, have you watched I think it's the 1989 movie Return to Oz?
I did, and it's an absolute nightmare. It terrifies
It's
me.
so scary. Oh my gosh, it's so good. Oh, so much imagination. I love that movie. Um, Nothing to do with Wicked, but man,
Yeah,
it's a great film.
yeah, no. Like The Wizard of Oz is not just like, or The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, the book series. There are like 14 different books.
Yeah.
And originally, L. Frank Baum just really wanted to just make a child's book, and it gained so much popularity that he ultimately kept making more books.
Hmm.
And when it comes to Wicked, it kind of goes in that similar vein. George McGuire was inspired by the books, and he wanted to dive deeper into various different types of themes of like the nature of evil versus nature versus nurture debate, as well as diving into themes of terrorism, propaganda, and existential purpose. So,
Yes.
so in this case, this book, the Wicked, the Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West, is a non-canon interpretation of The Wizard of Oz, uh, s- written by George McGuire. Wicked is a darker and more adult-themed revisionist exploration of the character of the Wicked Witch of the West. And in this book, we ultimately follow, and in the musical, we follow Elphaba from her birth, which is the Wicked Witch of the West, Elphaba, from her birth through her social ostracizations, school years, and radicalization up to her final days, quote unquote, depending on like the book and the musical. No spoilers
Mhm.
right now. Um, But what
Spoilers will be following. There's going to be a lot of
yes.
spoilers.
Have you ever seen so you've read the book. Have you seen the musical and or the new movie that came out?
Yes, I have. For those of you who are interested, who like to read Happy Hagfish, I did write about my horrible experience seeing the movie Wicked for the first time. But I saw the musical when I was 16 years old, and my honest opinion is that I didn't like it at the time. If I'm being completely honest, it did not land with me. However, I loved Phantom of the Opera, so
Mhm.
interpret that as you will.
Yeah, I am a big musical buff. I very much enjoy musicals. I got very excited when I saw Wicked the first time when I was in about 16 years old too, maybe 15, somewhere around then. Um, and I really liked it in a lot of ways. I think no, it wasn't my first musical, but I got excited when it came to the movie. I really enjoyed the movie. But when it comes to this, I always got really interested in Wicked and their themes of propaganda. How we
Mhm.
ultimately were throughout the movie or in the book and in the musical, we are ultimately shown like a different side than what we saw in the original Wizard of Oz, Dorothy's perspective. But in this retelling, we're following Elphaba and kind of getting a better understanding of what is the world of Oz. And in all honesty, there is some parallels. We do find out at the end of The Wizard of Oz and in the book The Wonderful Wizard of Oz that the wizard isn't actually a wizard. And
Mhm.
so this ultimately kind of gives us a better understanding of how did the public get a better get this perspective that he's this all powerful person. And it's
Mhm.
alluded within the retelling, the non-canon interpretation of the Wizard of Oz, that there was propaganda involved.
Yeah, so I have quite a few thoughts. And I did mention, I know I said earlier that when I was 16, I didn't really enjoy the musical. That was partially due to teen angst and wanting to be cooler than everybody else. But um, I will say that my appreciation for this particular story has deepened over the years, not just because of what Gregory Maguire did with his book, but because of how it influenced so many other stories. Like, I wasn't aware that this book came out in 1995, for
Mhm.
instance. I thought it came out a little bit later. But I feel like there are other properties that I love that were very much influenced by this story, Wicked. Just off the top of my head, theater kids are probably aware of the musical Twisted, which reimagines not the Wizard of Oz. It reimagines Aladdin, but through the eyes of Jafar.
Mhm.
And it is one of the funniest musicals I've ever seen in my life. Um, but yeah, I'm really impressed with how the writer, Gregory Maguire, he saw this story. He saw that there was this fantastic figure, the Wizard of Oz in the book, who was really just a con man.
Yeah.
And the way he was able to leap off of that and spin this entire new world, I'm so curious what his other influences were. Sorry, Andrew.
No, no, that's great. Everything you said is practically important to the whole conversation. And when we're
Mhm.
talking about propaganda, we have to like really dive into like various other themes and elements that emerge.
Mhm.
In the movie, and in the musical, we are ultimately introduced right away to various forms of propaganda, primarily with propaganda posters. I'm actually going to
Mhm.
edit this within the YouTube version of our podcast. Follow us and like and subscribe, and that'll become relevant later. But I'm
Mhm.
going to actually share with Alexandra some of the propaganda posters that we see, specifically as the story unfolds. The Wizard of Oz kind of creates this illusion or this perception that the Wicked Witch of the West, Elphaba, is
Mhm.
ultimately a bad person. And we see this within the opening scene with various different forms of propaganda. Can you
Uh,
describe the first propaganda poster I'm showing you?
it's interesting. So, looking at this picture, I'm seeing what looks like a 1940s era propaganda poster. with strong coloring. So the background has these like it looks a lot like fire. It has the red smoke and this yellow fire, and the image is of the Wicked Witch of the West. It's sort of like with her mouth open, claws out as if she is trying to grab you. And what I think is really interesting is that while this picture was, clearly styled to look like the main character in the movie, the actress, I think her name is pronounced Cynthia Erivo.
Mhm.
Um, the witch actually bears a striking resemblance to Margaret Hamilton, who
Yes.
played the original villain in the movie.
Yeah, no, actually I only was able to find two, but there are other propaganda posters that actually pay homage to the original Witch of the West. But I'm glad you also brought up the 1940s because a lot of these posters ultimately are uh very play striking similarities to World War One and World War Two propaganda posters. Specifically, I'm
Mhm.
going to scroll up to the two of them.
Ah.
Yeah, there's one specific World War One or World War Two propaganda poster where it is supposed to allude to the Axis. He's
Mhm.
watching you, and it was more
Yes.
associated with like submarine propaganda and stuff like that. But
Hmm.
there is one wicked propaganda poster that is strikingly similar. She's watching you. You, yes, you, the
Hmm.
Munchkins, report all sightings. And so we get the instant taste of propaganda instantly at the beginning of the movie, giving us the
Hmm.
idea that these are going to be relevant themes within the movie for the audience. But I think we need to
Hmm.
also talk about what is propaganda, because I think a lot of people will look at propaganda from a specific lens. We, when it comes to media literacy, want to encourage people to think more deeply of the information that we're engaging with. And a lot of times, and this is kind of a critique I have of how the public will talk about propaganda, is that they're basing it off their own biases. If you're not reinforcing
Hmm.
or supporting my biases, then you might be propaganda or your manipulation.
Mm.
Propaganda is communication that is primarily used to influence or persuade an audience to further an agenda, which may not be objective and may be selectively presenting facts to encourage a particular synthesis or perception or use of loaded language to produce emotions rather than rational responses to information that is
Mm.
being presented. So go on.
Okay. Um, well, no, as you're talking about this, and I'm really appreciating your explanation. Um, I was hoping that you could sort of weave this into what's going on with, let's say, Twitter, because
Mm,
Twitter is something that's at the forefront of people's minds, as well as The Daily Show, because I'm a big fan of The Daily
I
Show, and I'm
loved it.
curious. I
Yes.
love The Daily Show. And I'm curious how you would define The Daily Show, which is, a comedy show with definitely progressive leanings. How would you would define that within your definition of propaganda versus persuasion?
Okay. So a big thing about propaganda, I was going to go through a whole bunch of different definitions first, but like, one of the big things that we do need to recognize when it comes to the difference between propaganda and persuasion is that persuasion by its nature is transactional, or there's a dynamic interaction between the source and the receivers creating co-meeting. Persuaders who understand that persuasion is interactive or transactional, in which both parties approach a message event, can ultimately attempt to ultimately come to a common agreement. Or there's more of an active process between the audience and the source. You're not just passively absorbing this information, but you're engaging with it. A lot of
Mm,
propaganda will solely like focus more on the emotional side of things and ultimately
okay,
try to narrow down the perception for the audience because they're hoping that the audience will not think beyond that information. So
interesting.
they won't present evidence. They'll present mostly vibes, if we think about it like that. Uh, yeah, who ultimately, like, when it comes to propaganda, the lives it lives through the passive audience, those who do not question the propaganda but can reinforce it. At the same
Mhm.
time, persuasion seeks voluntary change, but propaganda doesn't. So in the case of the Daily Show, they're presenting their evidence. They're showing directly, like, the interviews that they do, getting direct quotes and showing us what people are saying. While in the case of propaganda, it can be ultimately more manufactured. Um,
Hmm.
and I do think we need to talk about the various different ways we look at propaganda. When we think about propaganda, we might think about, like, various different themes or various different ideas like deceit, distortion, lies, manipulation, spin, psychological warfare, or brainwashing. However, if we
Oh,
think
so fun.
Yeah. However, if we think deeper than that, we do not want to be influenced by our own biases, but we want to understand, like, different perceptions around propaganda and what it's all about, which is really the intent.
Hmm.
I'm going to butcher this name. Edward Bernays, often known as the father of public relation, was among the earliest people who have defined propaganda as a consistent, enduring effort to create or shape events to influence the relations of the public to an enterprise, idea, or group. A lot of times, propaganda will try to narrow down the focus, similar to persuasion, but there's this more enduring effort. There's less negotiation, as we see with persuasion, but more of the idea of presenting evidence in a consistent manner so the public starts to adopt it. It would also be
Hmm.
valuable to consider the purpose of propaganda while trying to define it. In fact, the purpose of propaganda is to send out an ideology to the audience with a related objective. And a lot of times, these types of objectives would be more to get the audience or the public to have that narrower perception without that
Hmm.
engagement.
I'm curious. Sorry to interrupt you, but I am curious. When we hear the word propaganda, it's always used negatively. With that in mind, do you think it would be possible to use propaganda for positive purposes, say to encourage people to wash their hands after going to the bathroom?
Actually, yes, absolutely. Let me give you my overall definition that I tend to use because there are also different approaches to propaganda. And generally, there are
Mhm.
three different approaches.
Okay.
So the definition that I tend to use is from Joelt and O'Donnell's definition of propaganda as it focuses more on the communication process.
Hmm.
Propaganda is a deliberate, systematic attempt to shape perceptions, manipulate cognitions, and direct behaviors to achieve a response that furthers the desires of the intent of the propagandist. In the case of it's more about the precise and methodological approaches carrying out
Hmm.
in an organized regulatory manner. Shaping
Okay.
perceptions is usually attempts through the use of language and images, slogans, posters, symbols. But also, when it comes to the formation of cognition or shaping attitudes, it is more complex process that relates to factors like personal values, emotions, or even cultural aspects. But getting to your point involved, like, propaganda doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad. It can be also gray or this app in the middle. When we're talking
Hmm.
about propaganda, it can be described in three different relationships: white, gray, and black. And it's more about the
Okay.
accuracy of the information that is being presented and the intent associated with it. White propaganda, or white propaganda overall, comes from the source that identifies correctly accurate information, and the information in the message tends to be very accurate. White
Okay.
propaganda White propaganda attempts to build credibility with the audience, for this could be useful at some point in the future. So, in many ways,
Hmm.
you can think about, like, different institutions, government institutions trying to build trust and maintain trust with the audience or within the public. So, in the case of your example, washing your hands during, like, COVID, uh,
Right.
you're being presented accurate information about why washing your hands would be valuable. But I would also point out, like, in this sense, you're still negotiating with the public. You're not telling them you have to do this. You're still
Right.
giving them the choice, like, you should, and here's why. All while the source is
Hmm.
trying to still maintain their credibility.
So that's really interesting. And it makes me think about um, a campaign that I'm sure you and I are both very familiar with because we grew up in the 90s and early 2000s, but the pretty aggressive smoking campaigns or
Yes.
anti-smoking campaigns.
I love them. They're kind of a weird
Mhm.
guilty pleasure for me. It's because it makes me feel uncomfortable, but it also is like sometimes these are so ridiculous. Like my favorite one is when
Mhm.
like the lady with the stoma on her neck
Mhm.
ends up taking a cigarette and smoking it directly from her throat. Makes me
Oh my
cringe, but
gosh.
I'm just like, it does affect people in a lot of ways.
Oh gosh. The two I can think of off the top of my head that weren't just like I don't necessarily know if they were accurate, but they were legitimately terrifying. Um, was one that involved a science teacher looking at a creature that very clearly looked like it was modeled after something like the xenomorphs from Alien. And the creature comes to life and starts attacking all of the children in the room. It's legitimately scary. It looks like something out of Starship Troopers. Um, versus another scene that I remember was so chilling. Also, I watched it late at night and I went to bed and had nightmares. It presented smoking as this glamorous, wonderful thing, and it was flashing between images of people like movie stars smoking, then cowboys smoking, then fancy businessmen smoking, before landing on an image of a person very clearly in the last stages of their life, wasting away in an empty hospital room. It was so grotesque and chilling that I remember I think I was 13, something like that. I had no intention of smoking, but I remember almost being angry at the commercial for making me feel so frightened.
Yeah, yeah, no. And speaking of smoking, I actually had a smoking example for the other one of the other types of propaganda that we encounter. And
Ooh.
I'll just go directly to that one. Gray
Sure.
propaganda. Gray
Mm,
propaganda somewhere falls between the idea of white propaganda and black propaganda. We've talked about
mhm,
white propaganda already, but black propaganda, though, is when the source is concealed or credited to a false authority and spreads lies, fabrication, and deception. Black propaganda is all about spreading this big lie, including all types of creative deceit. And in particular, in this type of approach, black propaganda includes all types of creative deceit, such as like generally lying, fabricating information, or even kind
mhm,
of like manipulating perceptions for the masses. While on the other hand, gray propaganda, like that middle ground, is somewhere between that. The source may or may not be correctly identified, and the accuracy of that information is uncertain. It relies on the ambiguity for the audience. So, in the case of gray propaganda, it is mostly to use to promote a viewpoint of the concealed sponsor in a way that's more palatable to a target audience, where the
mm,
public is, well, where those who are ultimately engaging with this propaganda works under the assumption that the ideas presented by a seemingly neutral source in many ways. And so we can think about that with like early days of the tobacco industry when we started getting more information that tobacco might not be that great for the public. So the
mhm.
tobacco industry relied heavily on gray propaganda by promoting studies that tried to argue that smoking wasn't really that bad for you.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
That also reminds me of those corn syrup commercials
Mhm.
that were briefly popular, I think around 2010, that tried to say that high fructose corn syrup was completely fine in moderation. I don't remember how successful those were, but
I
that's what
don't
it makes
know.
me think of. Mhm,
Yeah, I don't know. But overall, for a propagandist, the greater
mhm,
persuasiveness can sometimes be attained by disguising the source itself. And so we
mm,
see, in all honesty, we kind of see that a lot within the Wicked movie. We don't see the wizard until near the end.
mhm,
Or within the end of the first act, we don't see the wizard. He's behind the curtain. We see him in the book of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz in different forms. Actually, this is a fun fact. The wizard, the big head, it only as appears to Dorothy, while the other three see something else. I can't remember them off the top of my head, but like in the movie, we see the wizard as this big, all-powerful head, floating head, and we see that in kind of Wicked too. We don't see the source right away. And that kind of gives us the idea of it's more associated with gray propaganda. It's still kind of
Mm,
this illusion of what the wizard looks like.
interesting.
Yeah. And so when we think about propaganda in a lot of different ways, there are different types of definitions, but also characteristics that follow with propaganda as well. Uh, Biddle in 1931 argued that the psychology definition of propaganda incorporates four principles. It relies more on emotions, but never argues those emotions. It casts propaganda into a pattern of we versus an enemy, an us versus them dynamic. It reaches groups as well as individuals, and it hides the propagandist as much as possible, hides the source. At the same time, with the rise of the internet and social media, friend of the show, Dr. Renee Hobbs, she's somebody who I worked with and who helped me encourage me to go into a PhD program, kind
Oh,
of expanded these characteristics by considering the internet and social media, where propaganda it activates strong emotion. It also provides simplified information, and it can appeal to different types of emotions, such as hope, fear, and the dreams of the targeted audience, while also maintaining that us versus them dynamic. It attacks the opponent.
interesting.
So yeah.
I
So if
see
we
that. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly. So can you think of like any examples beyond like the hiding of the Wizard of Oz or the wizard that kind of
Mhm.
incentive promotes this idea of propaganda, whether it's white propaganda, black propaganda, or gray propaganda?
Oh gosh, in Wicked,
Mhm.
um, so in Wicked, the kinds of propaganda that we're seeing, it's interesting. I don't know if within Wicked I could personally distinguish between like the white, the gray, and the black propaganda, though we see at the beginning of the story, we have that song, Something Bad is Happening in Oz,
Yeah.
um, where the animals are very clearly aware of a conspiracy,
Mhm.
or something is targeting them. Um, and so I'm not entirely sure which color that would fall under, but it does seem like there is some very clear anti-animal propaganda happening
Yeah.
within the kingdom.
And that's kind of the big thing that's been associated with it. I would associate it kind of in a different, like with the gray propaganda. If we think about
Mm-hmm,
some of the examples that emerge within Wicked, we can see how the school helps structure or Shiz University within the movie and the book and the story around the great and powerful Oz. They kind of help reinforce propaganda in a lot of ways. If you look on the balconies, they ultimately have covered up like the history of the animals being associated um with humans. They've ultimately kind of covered up like the contributions. But the
mm-hmm,
general like one of the big things that Shiz does is kind of like reinforces the history of Oz that
mm-hmm,
that the wizard is promoting. Um,
hmm.
they highlight how the wizard, and we also see this the moment they get to the Emerald City, that he is the only one who can read the Grimoire, and he addresses all those problems that Oz has experienced. But also, they have other sources to reinforce the wizard's credibility. Madame Morrible, in
Hmm.
particular, everybody hypes her up. She's this amazing witch, this amazing wizard. And she reinforces the credibility of the wizard. You're seeing these other sources build up the propaganda.
I do think it's funny that it never really clicked for me. Every time I watch this, I'm always re-surprised by Madame Morrible being bad, even though it's in her name. It's
Yeah.
not as subtle. She's not a subtle character. And yet every time I'm like, you.
But I'm glad that you brought up the animals because that's kind of the general theme around the idea of the propaganda that's reinforced. Um, to kind of quote Dr. Dillamond, the goat professor, which that's kind of relevant in a lot of ways, and I'll get that into a bit. He straight up says, if you make it discouraging enough, you can keep anyone silent. And that's kind of a big major component within the use of propaganda. The goal of Oz is to silence the animals who are being ostracized, who are being blamed for the problems. And in particular, the big problem that before the wizard came was there was this massive drought, if I recall, that produced this scarce food and issues with agriculture in a lot of ways. The wizard came in and started to ultimately blame the animals. Um, and in this case, ironically, what the wizard did was scapegoat.
I see what you did there.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
more than positive that was an intention to have like well, a lot of people would be like, there are some critiques. Some people critique Wicked as like, well, Dr. Dillaban is not a cute animal, and we can't connect with that. And but that's not the point. And I think like McGuire intentionally made him a goat so he can use that pun of scapegoating.
That I agree with that, and that actually reminds me of something I read. The creators of District 9 actually once said when they were designing their aliens, they initially wanted to create aliens that were quadrupeds, but they
Yeah.
had to make them bipedal because they knew that people would have a difficult time sympathizing with aliens that were not bipedal like themselves.
Yeah. So scapegoating is political motivated conspiracy theories tend to believe that robust and sinister groups are behind societal woes. Scapegoating is based on two principles. Blame those who should not be blamed and not blame those who should be blamed. Scapegoating occurs when networks minimize their wrongs and maximize the wrongs of the outgroup. It's all about that in-group out-group dynamic. And
Right.
the wizard within the movie and the book really does promote this within Wicked. He's quoted in saying, "When I first got here, there was discourse and discontent, and where I come from, everyone knows the best way to bring folks together is to give them a really good enemy." And so the wizard employs
Mhm.
powerful propaganda to ensure that he can get away with stopping animals from speaking and going about their lives. Dr. Dilliman describes examples of his fellow animals who have lost their rights in Oz, beginning within the song Something Bad by sharing, I heard of an ox, a professor from Cox, no longer permitted to teach, who has lost all power of speech.
One thing I did notice about the musical versus the book is that the musical, I think, lays it out quite clearly, whereas the book, I would say, so much of the segregation and the poor treatment that characters receive feels very grounded in real life.
Mhm.
And so we have the song "Something Bad Is Happening in Oz," which, if I'm being honest, I don't think is the strongest song in the musical.
No, it's
And I
popular.
think a lot it's it's less popular.
Ha.
See what you did there.
Mhm.
It's not the most popular song. But in the book, one of the things I noticed was that we have the character Dr. Dillamond, and he just talks about how it was more expensive for him to go in first class to get a good seat on the train in order to go to work, and how he had to spend more money than everyone else in order to have the same rights as regular passengers on the train. And there was something so mundane about it that I appreciated how mundane and how evil it was, because that is such a classic example of segregation, of inequality, is making someone else pay more for something that you experience at a lower cost.
Yeah. And so when we think about propaganda, though, One of the
Hmm.
biggest goals of propaganda is to really shape perceptions. And
Right.
we don't even need to just talk about Wicked. We can even talk about the original book itself, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz.
Hmm.
In that book, after several adventures, the travelers arrived at the Emerald City to meet the Guardians of the Gate, who, before they can, which we see in the movie too, there's a guard. But what's the biggest difference between the movie and the book is that before Dorothy and her friends can actually enter the Emerald City, they're asked to put on some glasses, some green tinted spectacles to, quote, keep their eyes from being blinded by the city's brilliance. Then
Hmm.
the guard places these green tinted spectacles on Dorothy and her friends and lock them in place with a lock and key. But it's later revealed that the city isn't actually really green or emerald, but it's white, and the spectacles make the city look green to the citizens.
Honestly, I think that's such an incredible detail, and I would have really loved to see that in the movie, or in the Wicked movie. I think
I
that they should have included that.
I think so too, but like in the actual musical, that doesn't really happen. And actually, this is actually a really interesting thing. Because The Wonderful Wizard of Oz was the first book in Baum's series, there's a lot
Mhm.
of things that he ends up like retconning later on. Like in later books,
Mm.
it is Emerald, but in this
Okay.
one, it's not. And in actuality, they do play a little bit homage to that within the musicals, where there are people who are wearing emerald spectacles.
Mm.
But in
Okay.
this case, the green tinted spectacles in the book, the original book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, is worn by every citizen of the Emerald City and are symbolizing the wizard's deceit and the power of perception. In many ways, perception is reality. And so, what propaganda tries to do is control that reality. So another form of these types of factors too can come about with like the wizard's trickery. In some cases, though, he's not trying to be in the book. The wizard does not trick his subjects for malicious purposes, but in his view, he's doing it to make people happy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
And we can kind of see that too in like both the movie and the original book, where the wizard it was asked by the scarecrow, by the tin man, by the cowardly lion for these things that they believe that they don't have. The
Hmm.
scarecrow wanted a brain, but the wizard made the point, you do have a brain. The tin man wanted a heart, but the wizard made the point, you do have a heart. And the lion wanted the nerve, he wanted courage, but the as I said before, he had that. But they weren't really that satisfied with just being told that. So, what the wizard did is provide them trinkets so they could ultimately feel like they had it. While the wizard is considered a fraud, the subjects kind of accepted the propaganda in many ways.
They seem to enjoy it. And also, I just immediately thought of this from the wizard's perspective. Like every time someone asks him for something, could I just imagine him breaking out in a cold sweat and going, "Oh, like how am I going to spin this one?"
Yeah,
Almost.
and he's a con artist, so like that's his big thing, spin. But
Hmm.
as we made the point, perception is a major factor. So we can find this idea of perception emerging and shaping reality in the movie Wicked, specifically in my favorite song of the movie and
Hmm.
musical, Popular. To quote
Hmm.
Galinda uh, in her song,
Yes.
I remind them of their own behalf to think of celebrated heads of states, or especially great communicators. Did they have brains or knowledge? Don't make me laugh. They were
Popular?
right. Glinda refers to the fact that politicians and heads of states get by not because of their like particular smarts, particular skills, or in other cases too, their knowledge of effective policies, but because people would like to hang out with them. You could think of it like having a beer with a politician. Some people vote that way because they're charismatic, they're approachable. I can have a beer with them.
Sorry, it's funny because I know what you're saying is absolutely true, but the thought of having to spend time hanging out with a politician is just so awful to me. I could never imagine voting that way. But yes, you're absolutely right. Sometimes politicians they have the riz.
The Riz. Oh
They
God.
got the riz.
Oh, that's crazy. Um, so So when we're thinking about propaganda really emerging in Wicked, um, the scapegoating of the animals is probably the more like relevant in a lot of ways. The plight, as noted in Berger's dissertation, from the Wizard of Oz to Wicked, trajectory of the American myth. They're quoted in pointing out that the plight of the animals, as represented in the version of the Wicked by Maguire, echoes anti-Semitic propaganda used by Nazis to justify their containment and extermination of German Jews, which was framed with specifically uh, delegitimizing or production of propaganda to otherize people by relating them to animals.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Scapegoating is probably one of the more powerful components within propaganda. It gives the public a common enemy. It creates complicated topics and complicated situations and narrows it down to simplistic ideas. So, in the case of propaganda, we can also look towards the 1937 Institute for Propaganda Analysis to help with understanding some more of the characteristics. Uh, Among these characteristics, there tends to be like seven ideas associated with propaganda, or
Okay.
seven devices used. The first one is name calling. Tricks to make us accept a conclusion without fully consideration of the essential facts, by ultimately trying to delegitimize a person, making them seem more minuscule, the opposing view. Bandwagoning.
So,
Okay.
oh, I was just curious if I were to say Andrew is a poop head, would that be an example of one of those seven dimensions?
So are you using it in a way as an ad hominem? Like as an
As
attack
in,
on my character to ultimately spread an intentional message? I would say in this case, no, because
Mhm.
I might be a poop head. But if you're doing it in the sense of like trying for the intent to
Yes.
delegitimize opposing views or opposing credibility, then yes.
Okay, well, it's funny because I can think of much worse insults I have heard city officials say in public settings to describe people to absolutely delegitimize them. And I will not say them on this podcast.
Yeah. So another characteristic is bandwagoning, where we're ultimately trying to trick the public into thinking that based off their emotions that, well, the entire public supports this. There's this large group of people who support this. You should support it,
Mhm.
therefore.
Mm,
Uh, the next one is glittering generalities, an attempt to sway emotions through the shiny ideals or virtues, such as freedom, justice, truth. These things are great, but ultimately, with the interpretation of taking complicated topics and simplifying it in these soundbite ways.
mhm.
You also have flag waving, a trick in which propagandists hold up symbols such as flags or characteristics that the public ultimately feels connected with, cultural symbols or um, feelings of patriotism in many ways. It's the patriotic thing to do if you do X.
Mm,
The plain folks, a trick that is used by propagandists to demonstrate that they are like the rest of us, even though they might be living off in a mansion somewhere.
like that time Mussolini had a photo shoot of himself in the fields.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. He does that. He did that. Mussolini did that. Yeah, and so like a lot of times what a propagandist tries to do is try to ultimately connect with the general masses. And
Mhm.
while in the case of persuasion, you want to understand your audience, but remember, you are also trying to present evidence within your message. The plains folk, in the case of propaganda, you're just trying to create this image. You're not presenting evidence, but you're trying to distort perceptions to ultimately get people to feel one way. But
Mm.
speaking of evidence, another characteristic is testimonials. While testimonials can be incredibly valuable when it comes to evidence, to ultimately talk about experience, they can also be a straw vote too. Testimonials can trick individuals by getting them only to think about these one perceptions, one experience, and not providing supplementary evidence as well. I used to teach, well, when I taught public speaking, I would always make that point. Like, testimonials only offer a certain perspective, but you need to build that up with other evidence too. If you're providing that
Mm.
testimonial, supplement it with a statistic. And finally, stacking the cards. It's ultimately a trick in which propagandists, intentionally or unintentionally, stack the cards against the facts, ultimately trying to delegitimize or the facts, or try to establish that you have to pass this super high bar for these facts to be legitimate.
That's interesting. I feel like I can think of some examples of that, but do you mind providing one that you really like?
Oh yeah, let me think. I can't think of one off the top of my head. But I'm trying to think one in the case of Wicked. But I
Hmm.
think in the case of Wicked, you know what? Yeah, the loathing scene. Um, when we're ultimately trying to look at like Glinda trying to kind of delegitimize Elphaba throughout the beginning of the movie, where it's like Elphaba was able to ultimately get this awesome opportunity to work with
Hmm.
Madame Morrible, and kind of Glinda was like spreading these rumors to ultimately kind of build herself up, while also
Right.
being like, well, how did Elphaba get to here? By ultimately not presenting all these types of facts, but ultimately saying she needs to have X, Y, and Z accomplished.
Hmm.
I'm thinking
Interesting.
it was kind of like I can't I think that might be a good example. But yeah, in general, these different types of characteristics around um, propaganda can be ultimately used as devices to sway popularity or kind of get people to not think about the evidence at hand, but more feel feel something associated with the messages.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. So, in your view, can you think of any other examples that we saw within the movie or within the musical around the idea of propaganda?
Well, try and think of one. And listeners, if I ever sound like I'm taking too long to respond to something, it's because Andrew has a way of presenting information in such an interesting way that I do have to think about it for a few moments. I'm like, okay, wait, how do I really feel about this? Huh. Okay, so I'm trying to think of an example in the movie of some kind of propaganda. I can think of plenty of examples of manipulation.
Go for it.
Uh, Off the top of my head, whenever I think of the musical Wicked, I think a lot of the character Nessa Rose because I dislike her
Yeah.
intensely. I think she's very underwritten. I find her character, quite frankly, to be somewhat an ableist depiction of someone in a wheelchair. And in Wicked, um, there are scenes in which Galinda is
Galinda.
made Linda is made to seem like a good person because she is setting Nessa Rose up on a pity date with the man who
Mm.
wants with this guy Bach. That should not be a name. With
SpongeBob in
Bach
the movie
with SpongeBob.
because the
Galinda
actor
is
what's his name, Heath Slater, was actually SpongeBob in it, the SpongeBob musical.
unfortunately I know too much about Ethan Slater and Ariana Grande. Um, yeah, um, but what I think of is how what she was clearly doing, it was a clear manipulation tactic. She was manipulating Bach into asking out Nessa, sort of taking care of two problems at once in her eyes, getting this guy off her back while also, sort of winning. her enemy's sister to her side, manipulating her enemy's sister to like her more, um, which is a really low move. And so it could easily be interpreted as her, her doing a kindness, like setting up poor Nessa Rose
Mhm.
with this guy. But what she's doing is very much an act of cruelty. Um, and so that I thought was a moment. I don't necessarily know if it falls under propaganda, but I could see that as Galinda adding that to her roster of kind things that she does for other people.
Yeah.
Even though the truth is, if you dig into it, it really isn't that kind.
Yeah, so I think the big thing, yeah, that's more manipulation. The big thing that
Hmm.
I think we have to think about when it comes to propaganda is the idea of the mass communication element,
Right.
delivering the message to the public and not presenting the source and not actually allowing negotiation with the public, but creating these narrow perceptions, scapegoating, and manipulating perceptions for um, some sort of nefarious purpose.
Ah, okay. Well, in that case, I think a much more clear example, and I have a feeling you were thinking about this one, is when we first go into Dr. Dilliman's classroom
Mhm.
and we see that message written on the board.
Yes.
Animals should be seen and not heard.
I
Uh,
am so glad you brought that up because the most powerful form of propaganda is all about keeping people engaged. It's not about like, in that sense, like not engaged in like critical thinking of the message, but getting them to ultimately be supportive of that propaganda. The most powerful form of propaganda is when the propagandist doesn't need to make the propaganda anymore, but it becomes so culturally ingrained that the public starts producing their own propaganda. In that scene, we see that during Dr. Dilliman's teaching of the beginning of prejudice against animals, he flips a chalkboard, which he sees, or the public sees, the phrase or the vandalization of animals should be seen and not heard. This is the point when we as the audience realize that the public is helping produce this propaganda. It's
mhm.
the public is ultimately it's so culturally ingrained that only one person willing to stand up and push back against it was Elphaba, somebody who's also socially ostracized because of various circumstance. When the public starts engaging in producing their own propaganda, it tells those in power that it's ultimately been effective, becoming culturally ingrained.
Something that just occurred to me though is that Elphaba is very much presented as almost as if a character who has nothing to lose
Yeah.
because she's already universally reviled by her classmates. The only marginal connection she has to other people is her sister,
Yeah.
who clearly seems to see her more as a tool and caregiver than as a human being. Um, so I find these characterizations very interesting. In that, yes, it does take this other ostracized character to really see through some of this propaganda.
Yeah, and we see that at the end of Act One, and we're going to see that a lot through the Act Two movie, where Elphaba
Mhm.
is becomes a scapegoat in order to manipulate the public's fear into the wizard's political advantage. But here's the thing: none of Elphaba's good deeds can be overturned the public's perceptions, even though throughout. We'll see throughout Act Two, she's doing good. She's helping the animals. She's helping those who are being socially ostracized. You can't overturn those perceptions. But matter of fact, she embraces it. She's forced to accept that, even though she was born in Oz, her homeland holds her no place here. She doesn't care. She still continues to do good within Act Two. And actually, we kind of see, I'm pretty positive we see one of the propaganda posters that we mentioned within like what we think is the witch's lair in the movie at the beginning. And I think she
Mhm.
actually, in the musical, off the top of my head, she actually embraces it a lot. She starts to joke about it. She pushes back against the propaganda, but in a jokey way, not saying like trying to combat it with evidence, but kind of like mock it.
So it's interesting. My perspective of these events, have really been colored by what I've been reading in the book,
Mhm.
because Elphaba in the book is a terrorist.
Yeah.
Um, really isn't a gentle way of saying it. Terrorism becomes quite the theme of McGuire's book, in a way that I wasn't expecting, because I would say the musical gives Elphaba quite the attractive makeover, whereas the book is complex. It's really a complex read, and I wouldn't say there's any particular character who is all good or all bad. And while I think that makes for a great read, I think that would maybe make for a less uplifting musical.
Yeah.
Um, but part of the reason why I found that so interesting, and I don't want to go too much on the tangent, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, is because this book was written in 1995. And during that time, other media I had noticed that came around that time also would play with this idea of sort of what I'm going to call, or what I've seen other people call, the ethical terrorist. There is a podcast that I'm trying to find the name of it, Philosophers in Space. They record an episode about the show Star Trek: The Next Generation, and they call it The High Ground and Ethical Terrorism. And it specifically is about an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation that focuses on a group of terrorists, and really explores the issue from their perspective. And this happens again in Star Trek Deep Space Nine with the character Major Kira, who was also regularly throughout the show referred to as a terrorist because of her involvement with the Bajoran movement. And at the time, this didn't really connect for me, but I do think it's worth noting. I think at the time in the 90s, people were very focused on the events in Northern Ireland.
Mhm.
And so our perception of what was terrorism was colored by those events in Northern Ireland, where we would see people who would call themselves terrorists, who would commit acts of violence, but have these to them justifiable reasons. I sincerely hope that nothing I say makes light of any of the pain that someone else has felt was caused during this time. But I do think McGuire's book seems to have been heavily influenced by that as well. Like I see it like I see it in Star Trek episodes of the 90s. I feel like I also was seeing that in McGuire's work.
I can see that. Yeah. But
Hmm.
at this point, I think we should wrap things up. So,
Sure.
but to conclude, I want to make the point, quoting Jennifer Newberry's from the Wicked Company member. Power and
Hmm.
propaganda are highlighted with misinformation spread widely about Elphaba at the end of Act 1 and Act 2, with the lies
Hmm.
and propaganda that are used as a way to spread fear among the people of Oz. Those in power maintain their power over the people.
Hmm.
This is the moment, a moment of dehumanization of Elphaba. So overall, if we think about like the overall idea of how we can identify propaganda, propaganda
Hmm.
really highlights the idea of shaping perceptions without really engaging with the public. It is
Hmm.
more about like creating stirring emotions to ultimately get people to respond in certain ways. Um, to kind of remind people of the definition I tend to use by Jout and O'Donnell, propaganda is deliberate, systematic attempts to shape perceptions, manipulate cognition, and direct behaviors to achieve a response that furthers the desired intent of the propagandist. And so when it comes to advice, I would really try to encourage us to think more strategically, be an active audience member, and think about like what is the intent behind the message? Is it trying to inform, persuade, or entertain, or are they trying to do something else? What are the characteristics that they're employing? Are they showing us who the source is? Are they name calling? Are they trying to flag wave? Are they not presenting evidence, but presenting vibes and emotions? It's really
Hmm.
important for us to think deeper when we're engaging with messages, especially on political messages, because political messages can still be persuasive. But if there's that lack of engagement from us, we might be more manipulated than our other fellow man. So, do you
Agreed.
have any potential advice?
I just want to piggyback off of what you said. Going to reiterate something that you said. You mentioned the word emotions,
Hmm.
and I agree with what you said completely. And to further that, if there is a message that causes you to feel any kind of strong emotion, I guess take a moment to think about why you're feeling that strong emotion.
Yeah, I fully agree, and that's kind of a crutch of a lot of my research interest is expanding media literacy beyond just like this cognitive logic, but becoming more self-reflective of ourselves. When we're more self-reflective of our engagement with information, we become more aware of ourselves, aware of our biases, and then we can start thinking a little bit more critically, how is this media engaging with us? So, do you have any last minute thoughts?
I think I need to rewatch Wicked.
I think I might do too. I'm pretty positive the second movie will be coming out later this year.
Yes, yes. Who knows? Maybe Andrew, you might have to write a propaganda part two.
I'm down for that. I'm down for that. And in all honesty, there's this social media influencer. I can't remember her first name, but she goes by the Oz vlog. I think might want to invite her
Ooh, that's
or
fun.
try to. We can see it. Maybe we can if we get beyond 10 views a day,
Who knows?
who knows? But with that, any other last minute thoughts?
I feel like you've summarized everything really well.
All right. Well, with that in mind, always to you, the audience, check your sources, fact check what the evidence is saying, and to quote Edward R. Murrow, good night and good luck.